It begins with a brass plate, half buried in the silt of a forgotten basement in Lower Manhattan. It is a simple thing, a sequence of numbers meant to denote floor levels, yet the sequence breaks. It stutters, it skips as the 13 and moves with a forced, unnatural grace to the 14. We are told this is superstition. We are told this is a quirk of the American psyche, a harmless nod to triskaidekaphobia. But look closer at the masonry. Look at the way the load distribution shifts at that specific height, as if the building itself is flinching away from a void. Ask yourself why a modern architectural firm governed by the cold laws of physics and the even colder laws of profit would sacrifice square footage for a ghost. Not a ghost of a person, not a ghost of a tragedy. Something else, a ghost of a number. This isn't about luck. It's about a measurement that no longer fits the world we've been given. We are standing in the shadow of a grand architectural erasure, a global edit that has scrubbed the 13 from our elevators, our street addresses, and our historical timelines. What if the 13 wasn't skipped because it was unlucky, but because it was a key? What if it represents the frequency of a civilization that understood the resonance of the earth in a way we are no longer permitted to access? They call it Tartaria now, a name whispered in the dark corners of the internet, a catch-all for the ruins of a world that was too grand, too unified, and too efficient to be allowed to survive. When you walk through the streets of any major city, San Francisco, London, St. Petersburg, you see the same red brick, the same arched windows, the same copper domes that seem to reach for a static charge that no longer exists. You see a global aesthetic that predates the borders of the modern map, and in every one of these structures, the number 13 acts as a silent boundary. It is the locked door in the basement of history. It is the frequency that was tuned out. If you study the blueprints of the great world fairs, those ephemeral white cities that appeared and vanished in a single season, you find a recurring anomaly. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 was a marvel of neoclassical perfection, a sprawling landscape of power and light that supposedly sprang from the mud in mere months. But the mathematical ratios used in its construction do not follow the standard imperial or metric logic of the late 19th century. They follow a base 13 harmonic. It is a system of measurement that accounts for the wobble of the earth, the pull of the moon, and the specific vibration of the ionosphere. Ask yourself why we abandoned a calendar of 13 months of 28 days. We were told the Gregorian shift was for accuracy, not for convenience, something else. It was an institutional gatekeeping of time itself. By removing the 13th month, the blue month, the month of the void, the architects of our current reality severed our connection to the atmospheric energy that the Tartarian structures were designed to harvest. Look at the old photographs, the ones where the people look like ants scuttling through the ruins of giants. Notice the lack of power lines. Notice the presence of antennas on every roof, intricate ironwork that serves no decorative purpose. These were not ornaments. They were receivers, and the math required to tune them required the 13. When the old world was dismantled, through fires that burned too hot for wood, through floods that left silt in the second stories of buildings, through wars that targeted architecture over infantry, the first thing they took was the number. They broke the scale. They left us with a 12-tone world, a flattened reality where the resonance is gone and we are left to pay for the energy that used to be free. Consider the layout of Washington, D.C., a city built on a swamp, or so the story goes. We are taught about L'Enfant and the Masonic influence, the compasses and squares etched into the grid. But use a different lens. Look at the intersections that were renamed. Look at the lots that were merged. There is a missing 13 in the original survey of the district. It is a geographic blind spot, a hole in the map where the ley lines were supposed to converge. I stood at the corner where the 13th Street should have held a specific monument, and I found only a blank wall of government-issued limestone. No windows, no doors, just a heavy, reinforced silence. Ask yourself what happens when you remove a primary integer from the geometry of a city. You create a psychological friction. You create a population that is always slightly out of phase with its environment. This is the essence of institutional erasure. It is not just about burning books, it is about rewriting the physics of the space we inhabit. The Tartarian buildings, with their thick walls and deep foundations, were built to last for millennia. They were built on a grid that utilized the 13 to stabilize the human nervous system. When that number was forbidden, the buildings became unstable. They became fire hazards. They became obsolete. One by one, they were pulled down or renovated beyond recognition. The copper was stripped. The domes were capped. The 13th floors were renamed or walled off entirely, creating dead zones of air that still hum with a residual charge. If you listen closely in the quiet hours of the morning, in the heart of a city that shouldn't exist, you can hear that hum. It is the sound of a missing limb. It is the vibration of the forbidden. What if the history of the world is not a straight line of progress, but a series of resets? Every few centuries, the slate is wiped clean. The mud rises, the fires rage, and the survivors are handed a new set of rules and a simplified language. In this cycle, the 13 is the marker of the previous peak. It is the height we reached before we were cast down. In the archives of the Vatican, beneath the layers of sanitized scripture, there are maps that show a 13th continent, not Antarctica, not Atlantis, something else, a landmass that existed in the resonance between the others, accessible only when the math was right. The Tartarians travelled there. They drew power from it. They built a global civilization that didn't need coal, didn't need oil, and didn't need the permission of a central bank. This is why the 13 is forbidden. It represents a level of sovereignty that the current gatekeepers cannot allow. To acknowledge the 13 is to acknowledge that we are living in a diminished world, a curated cage. We are told the number is unlucky because they want us to fear the exit. They want us to look at the gap in the elevator panel and feel a sense of relief rather than a sense of loss. But the evidence is everywhere, hidden in plain sight. It's in the 13 stars on the Great Seal, a vestigial organ of a dead philosophy. It's in the 13 steps of the pyramid. They kept the symbols for themselves, but they removed the function for us. They turned a tool of liberation into a brand of authority. Ask yourself, who benefits from your superstition? Who benefits from the fact that you stop counting when the air starts to vibrate? I spoke to a retired structural engineer who spent 40 years working on the modernization of old municipal buildings in the Midwest. He spoke of non-Euclidean voids found behind the walls of courthouses and post offices. He spoke of floors that were not recorded on any official plan, spaces that were exactly 13 feet high and lined with a strange, silvery, conductive mesh. When these spaces were discovered, the work orders were immediately escalated to a federal level. The spaces were filled with concrete. The workers were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements. He told me, with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, that the buildings were breathing until they filled those voids. not breathing like a living thing, not breathing like a machine, something else. They were pulsing in time with a clock we aren't allowed to see. This is the institutional gatekeeping of the physical realm. We are told that history is a matter of records and dates, but it is actually a matter of load distribution and atmospheric resonance. The Tartarians didn't just build structures, they built a giant global instrument, and we are the ones living inside the broken casing, wondering why the music stopped. The 13 was the bridge. Without it, we are just noise. We are just consumers of a filtered reality, scrounging for scraps of energy in a world that used to be a battery. Think of the Great Fire of London, or the Great Fire of Chicago, or the Great Fire of San Francisco. Always a great fire, always a clean sweep of the old world. If you look at the after photos, you see something chilling. The wooden shacks of the poor are often still standing, while the massive stone and marble Tartarian structures are gutted. Stone doesn't burn like that. Brick doesn't melt like that. Not from a tipped lantern, not from a kitchen fire, something else. These were targeted demolitions. They were removals of the harmonic nodes, and in the rebuilding process, the grid was subtly shifted. The 13 was excised. The new buildings were smaller, weaker, and disconnected from the earth. They were built with 12-inch feet and 60-minute hours, a closed loop that keeps us focused on the clock rather than the horizon. We are told this is the modern era, but what if it's just the aftermath of a heist? The greatest theft in human history wasn't gold or land. It was the frequency of 13. It was the knowledge of how to live in harmony with the natural resonance of the planet. Now, we are taught to be skeptical of anything we can't measure with their broken rulers. We are taught to laugh at the conspiracy theorists who point to the mud-stained windows and the missing floors. But the skepticism is a shield. It's a defense mechanism against the terrifying realization that our entire civilization is a squatter in the ruins of a better one. In the 1920s, a group of independent researchers in Germany began to rediscover the 13 logic. They found that certain geometric shapes, when aligned with the lunar cycle, could produce a measurable cooling effect in the surrounding air. They called it vril, or orgone, or a dozen other names that have since been dragged through the mud of pseudoscience. But at its core, it was just the math of Tartaria. It was the restoration of the 13. The research was quickly seized. The scientists disappeared. The academic journals were scrubbed. Ask yourself why certain branches of physics are classified. Why is the study of the ether considered a dead end? It is because the ether is where the 13 lives. It is the medium that connects the domes of Moscow to the towers of New York. By denying the medium, they deny the connection. They keep us isolated in our little boxes of space and time, paying our utility bills to the very people who buried the free energy of our ancestors. The somber truth is that we are a colonized people, but the colonizers didn't come from across the sea. They came from within the institutions, rewriting our past to control our future. They turned the 13 into a bogeyman so we wouldn't look at it too closely. They made it forbidden because it is the only thing that could make us whole again. The urban explorer knows the truth better than the historian. In the deep tunnels beneath the cities, where the lost levels of the Tartarian grid still exist, the air feels different. It feels thick, charged, and heavy with a sense of forbidden knowledge. I have been in those places. I have seen the way the light bends in rooms where the number 13 is still etched into the lintels. It is not an unsettling feeling of evil, but an unsettling feeling of scale. You realize how small you have been made to be. You realize that your life has been lived in a narrow band of the spectrum. The staccato beat of the modern world, the tick-tock of the 12, is a heartbeat with a murmur. It is incomplete. The Tartarian silence is deeper, more resonant. It is the silence of a bell that has been silenced, but still remembers the ring. We are told to stay on the path. We are told to look at the new skyscrapers, all glass and steel and fragile intent, and see progress. But look at the base of those buildings. Look at the way they sit on the foundations of the old world, like a parasite on a host. They don't even know they are there. Or perhaps they do. Perhaps the architects at the very top, the ones who design the headquarters for the central banks and the global NGOs, still know the secret. Perhaps they still use the 13 in their private chambers while they feed us the fear of it in public. What if the 13 is not a number at all, but a doorway? In the old Tartarian texts, the ones that didn't make it into the great libraries, they spoke of a 13th gate that opened once every lunar cycle. It wasn't a gate in space, but a gate in perception. It allowed for a clarity of thought that made manipulation impossible. You cannot rule a people who can see the flow of energy. You cannot tax a person who can pull heat from the air. So, the gate had to be closed. The 13 had to be made unlucky. The narrative had to be shifted from empowerment to superstition. This is the ultimate form of institutional erasure, to make a tool of freedom appear as a source of dread. They didn't just hide the truth, they made us afraid to find it. Ask yourself why you feel that slight tremor of unease when you see the number 13. Is it yours, or was it placed there, not by a ghost? Not by a curse. Something else. A psychological imprint left by a century of careful conditioning. We are the inheritors of a broken world, walking through the corridors of a palace we are told is a prison. We must look at the world with new eyes. We must stop accepting the skips and the omissions as mere coincidences. The 13 is there, in the gaps between the bricks, in the silence between the seconds, in the shadows of the missing domes. It is the key to Tartaria, and Tartaria is the key to our stolen heritage. The investigation doesn't end in the archives or the ruins. It ends in the mind. It ends when we refuse to be afraid of the number that was meant to set us free. But even then, the loop remains open. Even if we reclaim the math, even if we rediscover the resonance, can we ever truly rebuild what was lost? Or are we forever destined to be the ghosts in the machine, haunting the 13th floors of a reality that has moved on without us? The pattern is clear, the evidence is mounting, and the institutional walls are starting to crack. But the truth is not a destination, it is a frequency. And once you hear it, you can never go back to the silence of the 12. What if the 13 is waiting for us to just count it? What if the forbidden is only forbidden because we agree to look away? The air is vibrating, the stone is breathing. Ask yourself, what if? The investigation deepens when we turn our gaze toward the cartographic anomalies of the 16th and 17th centuries. In the dusty stacks of the maritime archives, one finds maps that defy the conventional narrative of a primitive, disconnected past. They show a unified global network under the banner of Grand Tartaria, a territory stretching from the Caspian Sea to the frozen reaches of the Pacific. But the coordinates on these maps do not align with our modern GPS. They rely on a 13-point navigational grid that accounts for the curvature of the Earth in a way that our current flattened projections cannot replicate. We are told these maps are errors. We are told they are fantasies of explorers who had spent too many months at sea. Not errors, not fantasies, something else. They are records of a different physics. In these maps, the number 13 is the anchor of the prime meridian. It is the 0 point of the world. When the institutional gatekeepers synchronized the clocks of the world at Greenwich, they didn't just standardize time. They moved the center of the world. They shifted the anchor. By relocating the prime meridian, they effectively erased the 13 from the spatial awareness of the human race. Ask yourself why the most ancient structures on Earth, the pyramids of Giza, the temples of Angkor Wat, the ruins of Tiwanaku, all align with a celestial clock that requires a 13th zodiacal sign, Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer, the forgotten constellation. It was removed from the popular sky, cast out of the 12-house system that governs our horoscopes and our psychological archetypes. What if the suppression of the 13 in the sky was the prerequisite for its suppression on the ground? The Tartarians built their cities as mirrors of the heavens. When the stars were edited, the cities were doomed to fall out of sync. The silence of the archives is a heavy manufactured thing. If you look for the word Tartaria in modern textbooks, you find a void. You find a mention of Central Asian tribes or the Mongol Empire. But the grand industrial civilization that produced the star forts and the atmospheric energy collectors has been systematically redacted. This is the erasure trope in its most aggressive form. It is a scorched earth policy of the mind. I spent weeks in the basement of a university library tracking the lineage of structural engineering textbooks. Around the year 1880, there is a sharp rupture. The language changes. The technical terms for atmospheric induction and static load resonance disappear, replaced by the clunky, inefficient logic of steam and coal. It was a downgrade disguised as a revolution. The 13-based mathematics that allowed for the construction of self-sustaining, resonance-tuned buildings was replaced by a 12-based math that required constant external fuel. They took our autonomy and sold it back to us as utility. Ask yourself why the great cathedrals, those power stations of the old world, have organs with pipes that are tuned to frequencies we are now told are dissonant. They were not playing music for the ears. They were playing music for the cells. They were vibrating the 13 into the very marrow of the people who stood within those walls. Not a religion, not an art form. Something else, a biological calibration. When the new regime took over, they retuned the instruments. They changed the pitch. They made the 13 sound like a mistake, a jarring note in a sanitized symphony. Consider the phenomenon of the star fort. These massive, geometrically perfect stone fortifications are found on every continent, from the shores of Japan to the heart of the American South. We are told they were built for cannon warfare, to provide overlapping fields of fire. But look at the complexity, look at the fractal precision. A star fort with 13 points is a mathematical impossibility according to the military doctrine of the 1800s, and yet they exist. They are being bulldozed as we speak, turned into parks or historical sites where the geometry is obscured by trees and plaque-covered lies. These were not forts, they were processors. They were the nodes of the Tartarian energy grid, and the 13 pointed stars were the most powerful among them. They were the capacitors that held the charge of the earth. When you stand in the center of a dismantled star fort, you can feel the drag on your senses. It is a phantom limb of a global machine. The institutional gatekeepers call them outdated defences. But why are they so eager to hide the ruins? Why is the soil around these sites consistently found to have high levels of quartz and conductive minerals that have been fused at a molecular level? Not a battle, not a siege, something else. A systematic short-circuiting of the world. We are living in a reconstructed reality, a stage set built on the foundations of a giant. Every time you see a historic building with its lower windows half submerged in the earth, what the online community calls mud flood evidence, you are seeing a building that has been forcibly lowered into the silence of the 12. We are told that street level rose due to poor sanitation or the accumulation of waste. Ask yourself how 30 feet of waste can accumulate in a decade without burying the people along with the stones. The truth is more unsettling. The earth itself was manipulated, the resonance was broken, and the crust settled in a way that swallowed the ground floors of the old world. The 13, which acted as the stabilizer, was removed, and the world literally sank. The new authorities simply built over the top. They renamed the second floors the first and relegated the true foundations to the realm of cellars and sewer systems. They buried the math under the mud. They turned the 13 into a basement, a place of darkness and shame, where we keep the things we are afraid to remember, but the stones don't lie. The load distribution of a mud-flooded building reveals a structural intent that goes deep into the earth, far beyond what is necessary for a mere basement. These buildings were designed to be rooted, to be part of the terrestrial circuit, and the circuit is broken. What if the Dark Ages were not a period of ignorance, but a period of cleaning? A time when the remnants of the 13 logic were rounded up and destroyed. The Inquisition, the Crusades, the endless civil wars of the 19th century, these were not about ideology. They were about the collection and destruction of Tartarian artifacts. They were about the suppression of the 13. I found a reference in a private collection to a 13th table, a mathematical cipher that allowed for the translation of the old world's blueprints. It was supposedly held by a guild of masons who refused to bow to the new standard. They were hunted across Europe. They were branded as heretics and occultists. This is the origin of the unlucky 13. It wasn't unlucky for the people. It was unlucky for the authorities. It was the one number they couldn't control, the one frequency they couldn't muffle. So they made it a curse. They wove it into the folklore, into the nursery rhymes, into the very fabric of our childhood fears. Not a superstition, not a myth, something else, a psychological fence. Look at the periodic table of elements. We are taught that it is an objective map of the building blocks of the universe. But look at the gaps. Look at the way the noble gases are arranged. There is a missing resonance, a 13th group that accounts for the properties of the ether. By removing this group, the institutional gatekeepers have limited our chemistry to the realm of the dense and the slow. We are stuck with a combustion civilization because we have been denied the resonance civilization. The Tartarians used the 13 to bridge the gap between matter and spirit, between the stone and the light. They built machines that didn't need to burn anything because they were tuned to the heartbeat of the vacuum. This is the forbidden knowledge. This is why the patents for free energy devices are always seized under national security protocols. It's not about the technology, it's about the math. If you allow the 13 back into the laboratory, the entire house of cards, the oil economy, the central banks, the controlled scarcity collapses in an afternoon. They are not protecting the world from dangerous inventions. They are protecting themselves from a world that doesn't need them. The staccato pulse of our modern lives, the 9 to 5, the 60-second minute, the 24-hour day, is a rhythm designed to keep us tired. It is a disharmonious beat that grinds against the natural cycles of the body. The Tartarian 13 was a rhythm of rest and rejuvenation. It was a frequency that allowed the mind to expand into the theta state while fully awake. Imagine a world where every building you entered was a healing chamber, where every city square was a source of vitality. This was the world before the reset. This was the world of the forbidden number. We see the remnants of it in the grand asylums and hospitals of the 19th century. Massive, ornate structures that look more like palaces than prisons. We are told they were built to house the insane, not the sick, something else. They were the survivors of the previous cycle, the ones who still remembered the resonance of the 13. They were institutionalized to prevent the spread of their knowledge. They were the last of the Tartarians, and their homes were turned into their cells. Ask yourself why the most powerful organizations on Earth are obsessed with ritual and geometry. From the layout of the UN headquarters to the symbolism of the world's fairs, there is a recurring obsession with the numbers they tell us are meaningless. They are using the 13 in secret to maintain their grip on a 12-tone world. It is the ultimate hypocrisy of the gatekeepers. They have stolen the key and told us that doors don't exist. They live in a world of depth and colour, while they force us to live in a world of shadows and grey. The sombre reality is that we are the ones who are outdated. We are the ones who are obsolete. We are a simplified version of what humanity used to be, a trimmed down model designed for efficiency and obedience. The 13 is the part of us they cut away. It is the intuition, the connection, the sovereign power of the individual. In the urban exploration of the mind, we find that the most guarded secrets are those we have been trained to overlook. The missing 13 in the elevator is a glitch in the matrix, a tiny crack in the facade that reveals the magnitude of the lie. It is a reminder that the world was once much larger, much more vibrant, and much more free. The institutional erasure is nearly complete, but it can never be perfect. The resonance is too strong. The stones are too heavy. The truth is still there, vibrating in the silence of the forbidden. We are standing at the edge of a realization that changes everything. If the 13 is real, then history is a lie. If history is a lie, then the people who told it have no authority over us. The walls are not made of stone. They are made of a frequency we can choose to change. The search for Tartaria is not a search for a lost empire. It is a search for our lost selves. It is an investigation into the fundamental nature of the reality we inhabit. We are the detectives, the essayists, the explorers of a ruined world, and the evidence is pointing to a single, inescapable conclusion. The 13 was not removed because it was unlucky. It was removed because it was us. It was our power, our harmony, our place in the cosmic order. And until we reclaim it, we will continue to wander through the ruins, wondering why the lights won't turn on. The loop is tightening. The patterns are repeating. The 13 is calling from the shadows of the skyscrapers and the depths of the mud-flooded streets. Can you hear it? Or are you still counting to 12? The architectural record is not a timeline of progress, but a crime scene of structural replacement. If you examine the foundations of the great cathedrals of Europe or the administrative palaces of the Russian Empire, you find a subterranean layer of basalt and granite that predates the brick. These foundations are not measured in feet or meters. They are measured in a unit of 13-inch spans, a harmonic distance that matches the standing wave of the Earth's crust. We are told these buildings were the work of primitive labourers with pulleys and ropes not pulleys, not ropes, something else. They were assembled using acoustic levitation, a technology that requires the 13th tone, the lost solfeggio, to negate the pull of gravity. Ask yourself why every modern construction site is a cacophony of diesel engines and grinding metal. It is because we have lost the silence of the 13. The Tartarians did not fight the earth, they vibrated with it. They built star forts with 13 points because those points acted as a multiphasic anchor, tethering the structure to the planetary grid. When the reset occurred, the first objective was the retuning of these anchors. The institutional gatekeepers sent out teams of surveyors who were actually acoustic engineers. They didn't just map the land, they muted it. They broke the 13 pointed stars, shearing off the extra points to fit a 12-tone military geometry. They turned generators into tombs. This is the institutional erasure of the physical laws of our reality. They gave us a version of physics that is heavy, expensive, and finite, while burying the version that was light, free, and infinite. Look at the history of the asylums that appeared in the mid-19th century. These were often the grandest buildings in their respective states, sprawling complexes with ornate towers and intricate copper roofing. We are told they were built for the compassionate care of the mentally ill. But look at the census records. Many of the patients were simply people who refused to adopt the new Gregorian calendar, or who insisted on using the old 13-month system of the harvest. They were the chronological dissidents. They were the people who remembered the blue month, the intercalary period where the veil between the physical and the etheric was at its thinnest. The gatekeepers could not have a population that operated on a different time stream. So they labelled the memory of the 13 a delusion. They used these massive Tartarian power stations turned prisons to re-educate the survivors of the mud flood. They used early forms of electroshock therapy to scramble the natural resonance of the human brain, forcing it to sync with the artificial 60 hertz hum of the new industrial grid. This was the birth of the modern mind, a fractured, time-bound consciousness that is perpetually slightly out of tune with its own biology. We are the descendants of those who were broken until they could only count to 12. The phenomenon of World's Fairs serves as the greatest cover-up in human history. These were not celebrations of progress. They were clearance sales of a defeated civilization. The White City of Chicago, the Jewel City of San Francisco, these were existing Tartarian hubs that were discovered, whitewashed with plaster of Paris, and then systematically dynamited after the gates closed. They told us the buildings were temporary, made of staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp. Ask yourself why a temporary building would require a foundation of deep-driven piles and a sophisticated underground pneumatic transit system. What if the fires that accidentally broke out at the end of every fair were actually controlled demolitions of the 13th nodes? The gatekeepers invited the public to marvel at the wonders of the old world one last time, to see the free energy and the grand scale, and then they burned the evidence before anyone could ask how it worked. They replaced the 13-foot-high doors with standard human entrances. They lowered the ceilings. They partitioned the grand halls into cramped offices. They took a cathedral of light and turned it into a DMV. This is the essence of the transition, the compression of human potential into a manageable 12-sided box. In the 1950s, a secretive branch of the military conducted experiments in atmospheric shielding. They were terrified of the residual charge that still lingered in the ionosphere from the Tartarian era. They launched rockets designed to hole the Van Allen belts, attempting to bleed off the excess energy that was still being gathered by the remaining copper domes in cities like Moscow and Washington. They called it Project Argus. Not defense, not research, something else. It was an attempt to finalize the erasure. They wanted to make sure that even if someone rediscovered the 13-based math, there would be no energy left in the sky for them to harvest. They were trying to ground the heavens, but the earth remembers. The ley lines, which are the nervous system of the planet, still pulse at the 13 Hz frequency. This is why certain places, vortexes, like Sedona or Glastonbury, feel so different. They are the spots where the institutional gatekeeping has failed to fully suppress the original signal. They are the leaks in the 12-tone reality. When you stand in these places, your internal clock begins to drift. You feel a sense of expansion, a sudden clarity that the world is much older and much stranger than you were taught in school. Ask yourself why the number 13 is the only one that is consistently forbidden across cultural and institutional boundaries. In aviation, there are no row 13s on many airlines. In hospitals, there are no operating room 13s. This isn't about superstition, it is about interference. The gatekeepers know that at the 13th interval, the probability of a glitch in the curated reality increases. It is a point of instability where the artificial laws of the 12-tone system begin to break down and the underlying Tartarian physics starts to peek through. They don't want you to have a lucky or unlucky experience. They want you to have a standardized experience. They want you to remain within the predictable bounds of the 12. If you were to sit in a row 13 at 30,000 feet, you might perceive the atmospheric energy collectors that are still visible from the upper atmosphere, the clouds that move against the wind, the structures that are invisible to radar but palpable to the human spirit. They cannot risk the awakening. They cannot risk the 13 becoming a destination rather than a bypass. Consider the Great Reset of the 19th century, often disguised as the Industrial Revolution. Before this period, the world was a garden of ornate stone and free energy. After, it was a factory of smoke and labour. The transition required the removal of the 13 from our educational systems. We were taught Euclidean geometry, a flattened two-dimensional lie that ignores the torsion and the spiral of the 13. We were taught history as a series of names and dates rather than a study of architectural resonance. The Library of Alexandria didn't burn by accident. It was a targeted strike against the 13-month astronomical tables. The destruction of the Summer Palace in Beijing wasn't an act of war, it was an act of intellectual sanitization. Every time a new empire rose, its first task was to rewrite the math. They took the 13 and buried it under the weight of tradition and superstition. They made us laugh at the very thing that could save us. I have spent years mapping the missing floors in the skyscrapers of the world. It is a staggering pattern. If you take the total number of skipped 13 floors in New York City alone, you have enough volume to house an entire hidden city. Where does that space go? In some buildings, the 13 is used as a mechanical floor, filled with humming transformers and cooling fans, but in others, the elevator bypasses a space that is 10, 15, 20 feet tall, and there is no record of what is inside. I have bribed night porters and security guards to let me into the dead zones. What I found was not machinery. It was silence. Not a normal silence, not a quiet room. Something else. A vacuum of sound where the air itself feels pressurized. The walls in these spaces are often lined with lead or a copper mesh Faraday cage. They are buffer zones designed to absorb the excess resonance of the building's height, preventing the people on the floors above and below from accidentally tuning into the forbidden frequency. The buildings are still trying to be Tartarian antennas, and the gatekeepers are using the skipped floors as mufflers. The urban explorer who ventures into the lower levels of old European cities finds a world of arches within arches. The further down you go, the more the architecture shifts toward the 13 harmonic. The stones become larger, the joints tighter, the geometry more complex. You realize that the primitive ancestors we are told about were actually the ones living in the ruins of a superior race. We are like children who have found a discarded smartphone and are using it as a hammer. We use the old Tartarian buildings for offices and apartments, oblivious to the fact that they were once components of a global neural network, and the number 13 was the admin password. It was the code that allowed the user to access the core functions of the planet. Now, the password has been forgotten by the public, though it is still held by the few who sit in the windowless rooms on the 14th floor. Ask yourself why the global elite are so obsessed with climate change and energy transitions. They aren't worried about the environment. They are worried about the reawakening of the Earth's natural resonance. As the solar cycle intensifies, the 13 Hz frequency is becoming harder to suppress. The old energy is leaking back into the grid. The mud-flooded buildings are starting to hum again. The institutional gatekeepers are scrambling to implement a new green infrastructure that is actually just a more sophisticated way to ground out the returning Tartarian charge. They want to replace the old copper and stone with smart materials that can be remotely tuned to maintain the 12-tone suppression. They are building a digital cage to replace the physical one. They are trying to ensure that the 13 remains a ghost in the machine, a forbidden number that no one knows how to dial. But the loop is closing. The more they try to erase the 13, the more obvious the gap becomes. We are starting to see the edges of the curtain. We are starting to realize that the unlucky number is actually the exit sign. The investigative journey takes us from the basement plates of Manhattan to the star forts of the world, and finally back to our own perception. The 13 is not a number to be feared. It is a frequency to be remembered. It is the vibration of the world before the shadows fell, before the fires burned, and before the history books were rewritten. It is the key to the forbidden knowledge of Tartaria, and it is hidden in the one place they can never fully reach, the resonance of the human soul. What if the 13th floor isn't empty? What if it's where the rest of our lives are being kept? Ask yourself, what if? The record of the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair contains a series of photographs that the official archives classify as construction progress. In them, we see the cascades and the festival hall, towering structures of breathtaking complexity, supposedly built of wood and plaster in less than 2 years. But if you apply a forensic zoom to the background of these plates, you see the truth. You see the weathered stains of decades of rain on the cornices. You see the deep, settled cracks in the temporary lagoons. These were not built for the fair. They were excavated. The St. Louis site was a primary Tartarian administrative hub, a city of the 13, and the fair was merely the celebratory shroud placed over its corpse before the demolition began. Ask yourself why the centerpiece of the fair was the Louisiana Purchase Monument, a 100-foot obelisk that mirrors the proportions of the ancient Egyptian needles. It was a tuning fork. It was set to a specific hertz that corresponds to the 13th harmonic of the Mississippi River Basin. When the fair ended, they didn't just tear it down, they buried it. They pumped millions of tons of earth back into the site, creating the forest park we see today. They smoothed over the geometry. They silenced the resonance. Not a park, not a memorial. Something else, a mass grave, for a technology that functioned on a scale we are no longer allowed to perceive. This institutional erasure is not limited to the soil. It extends to the very fluid that sustains us. Water. The Tartarians understood that water is a medium for information, a liquid crystal that responds to the geometry of its container. If you look at the fountains of the old world, the ones in Rome, in Peterhof, in the vanished courtyards of the Alhambra, the basins are always shaped in cycles of 13. These were not decorative, they were structuring stations. They used the natural magnetism of the earth and the specific angles of the 13-sided polygon to create hexagonal water, a state of H2O that is highly conductive and biologically optimized. We are told that modern water treatment, chlorination, fluoridation, the brutal right angles of PVC piping, is for public health, not for health, not for safety, something else. It is a systematic destructuring. By forcing water through a 12-tone, right-angled grid, the gatekeepers kill its ability to hold the Tartarian charge. They turn the living blood of the earth into a sterile solvent. This is why the old healing springs were always associated with the number 13. They were the places where the water still remembered the original frequency. They were the places where the institutional gatekeeping had not yet reached. In the 1870s, a strange phenomenon was recorded across the telegraph lines of the Northern Hemisphere. During solar storms, the machines would begin to print gibberish, but not random characters. They printed repeating sequences of 13. The operators called it the ghost in the wire. What they were actually witnessing was the residual Tartarian grid trying to handshake with the new, inferior electrical systems. The copper-domed buildings, many of which had not yet been stripped of their mercury-filled ether snatchers, were still pulling energy from the atmosphere. They were broadcasting on the 13 band. The response from the authorities was swift. They implemented grounding standards that required every building to be physically tethered to the earth in a way that bled off its excess charge. They called it fire prevention. But ask yourself why the great fires of that era always seem to start in the most energetically active districts. These were not accidents. They were the results of the grid being deliberately overloaded by the new power companies. They pushed too much dead current into the live Tartarian wires, causing the buildings to literally combust from the inside out. They burned the old world to make room for the metered world. They turned the 13 into a cinder. Consider the layout of the Great Pyramid of Giza. For centuries, we were told it had 4 sides. Then, with the advent of aerial photography, it was revealed to have 8. Each face is slightly concave. But if you calculate the internal chambers, the air shafts, and the subterranean wells, you find a system designed to process 13 distinct atmospheric pressures. It was a massive stone-state, solid-state resonator. The king's chamber was tuned to the 13 Hz heartbeat of the planet. We are told the pyramids were tombs, not monuments, something else. They were the master clocks for the Tartarian network. They synchronized the vibration of every star fort and every copper dome across the globe. When the gatekeepers discovered the pyramids, their first act was to remove the casing stones, the highly polished limestone that acted as the insulator. They stripped the machine, they took the battery and left us with a mystery. They want us to look at the pyramids as an unsolvable puzzle from a primitive past rather than a deactivated piece of hardware that we could restart tomorrow if we only knew the math of the 13. The staccato rhythm of modern science is based on the peer review system, which is the ultimate tool of institutional gatekeeping. If a discovery utilizes the 13 logic, it is simply not published. It is labeled fringe, pseudo, or anomalous. I have spoken to physicists who have found that at the 13th level of subatomic nesting, the laws of thermodynamics appear to reverse. Entropy decreases. Order emerges from chaos. Energy is gained rather than lost. This is the 0 point that the Tartarians exploited, but because it doesn't fit the 12-tone closed system models taught in universities, it is suppressed. We are living in a scientific dark age, illuminated only by the flicker of burning fossil fuels. We are told that perpetual motion is impossible, and it is in a 12-tone world. But in the 13-tone world of Tartaria, motion was not something you created. It was something you tuned into. The planet is already moving. The atoms are already vibrating. The Tartarians simply knew how to hitch a ride. The forbidden number is the clutch that engages the human mind with the cosmic engine. Look at the great library trope. Every time a major Tartarian archive is found, it is either lost in a fire or sealed for national security. The Smithsonians of the world are not museums of history. They are warehouses of erasure. They are the places where the giant skeletons, the 13-month calendars, and the Mercury vortex engines are taken to be forgotten. I have seen the shipping manifests for unlabeled crates leaving the sites of demolished star forts. They aren't going to scrap yards. They are going to underground facilities where the 13 is studied in secret by the very people who tell you it's a superstition. They are the secret society of the 12, using the 13 to stay ahead of the rest of us. They have the high definition version of reality, while they broadcast the standard definition to our homes. Ask yourself why the elite schools still teach Latin and Greek, the dead languages of the old world. It is because those languages are built on the 13-syllable hexameter. They are resonant languages. They allow for a type of thought that is impossible in the staccato English of the modern world. In the urban exploration of the subway systems in cities like London and Paris, you often find ghost stations that were never opened to the public. These stations are not modern. They are lined with the same glazed brick found in the foundations of Tartarian palaces. They were part of an older pneumatic transit system that used the pressure of the 13 Hertz wave to move pods at incredible speeds. The modern subway was simply laid over the top of this existing network. But if you look at the maps, the ghost stations are always located at the intersections of the 13-point grid. They are the nodes that the gatekeepers couldn't figure out how to repurpose, so they walled them off. They are the empty spaces in our commute, the moments of darkness between the lights where the old world still waits for a passenger. What if the trains are still running, but we no longer have the frequency of the ticket? The somber truth is that our entire visual environment has been flattened. The Tartarians used fractal architecture, where every small part mirrored the whole, usually in a ratio of 13. This created a sense of belonging in the observer, a psychological resonance with the building. Modern brutalist architecture, the concrete boxes and glass shards, is designed to do the opposite. It is designed to shatter the observer's attention. It is a visual noise that prevents the mind from settling into the 13 Hertz theta state. We are being visually lobotomized by our own cities. The institutional gatekeepers want us to feel alienated, small, and temporary. They want us to feel like consumers in a world that was built by creators. They have taken the divine proportion and truncated it, leaving us with a world that looks almost right, but feels fundamentally wrong. This is the uncanny valley of our history. Ask yourself why the number 13 is so prevalent in the branding of the gatekeepers themselves. The 13 stripes, the 13 arrows, the 13 leaves. They are marking their territory. They are telling each other that they are the masters of the 13, the ones who have harnessed the forbidden number for their own ends. It is a hidden, in plain sight signal of dominance. They have taken the tool of the people and turned it into a badge of office. They want us to see the 13 and think unlucky, while they see the 13 and think power. This is the ultimate institutional erasure. They haven't removed the number. They have inverted its meaning. They have turned the sun into the shadow. The investigation has led us to a terrifying realization. We are not just living in the ruins of Tartaria. We are living in the waste product of its destruction. The pollution, the noise, the stress, the 12-tone grind. These are the symptoms of a world that is being taxed by its own geometry. The 13 was the tax-free frequency. It was the sovereign math. And until we reclaim it, we will continue to pay the interest on a debt we never signed for. The loop is closing. The evidence is everywhere. The forbidden is only forbidden because we haven't yet dared to speak its name. But the bricks are humming. The water is waiting. And the 13 is ready to be counted. What if the end of the world is just the end of the 12? What if the new world is just the old world with its 13 restored? Ask yourself. What if? The skeletal remains of the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco offer a final chilling structural proof of this global edit. History tells us this jewel city was a temporary construction of wood and plaster, built to celebrate the opening of the canal. Yet, the Palace of Fine Arts, the only major structure allowed to remain, is not a lath and plaster shell. Its foundations are deep set, reinforced with a high-density, red-hued concrete that resonates at a specific frequency when the tide hits the nearby bay. If you measure the colonnade, you find the pillars are not spaced by the foot, but by a 13-unit harmonic that matches the seismic pulse of the San Andreas Fault. This was not a pavilion, it was a stabilizer. The Tartarians understood that the earth is a living, vibrating pressure vessel, and their architecture served as the relief valves. By removing the 13 from these coastal nodes, the institutional gatekeepers didn't just change the view, they unanchored the land itself. Ask yourself why natural disasters earthquakes, fires, and floods became so much more frequent and devastating precisely as the Tartarian grid was dismantled. It wasn't climate change, not shift in weather, something else. It was the loss of the architectural dampers. We are told the palace was saved by a group of concerned citizens, not saved, not preserved, something else. It was too energetically vital to be destroyed without risking the collapse of the entire peninsula. They kept the battery, but stripped the wires, leaving us with a beautiful, hollow monument to a science we are no longer allowed to practice. Consider the 13 colonies that formed the bedrock of the American experiment. We are taught this was a geopolitical accident of British settlement, but look at the original surveyor's marks. Look at the way the borderlines of those first 13 states intersect at specific geodesic points. They form a massive continental scale resonator. The founders, men steeped in the forbidden hermetic traditions, knew they were inheriting a portion of the Tartarian grid. They used the 13 not as a count of land, but as a seal of power. But the gatekeepers who followed them saw the danger of a population living within such a potent geometry. Slowly, the grid was diluted. New states were added to break the harmonic. The capital was moved. The 13-month lunar cycle, which the indigenous peoples of the continent had used to stay in sync with the land, was replaced by the stuttering, uneven Gregorian calendar. We were forced into a 12-tone time loop, a standardized existence that keeps our heart rates high and our intuition low. The somber truth is that the land of the free was built on a foundation of free energy, but the meter was installed before we could learn how to read the dial. They turned our heritage into a museum and sold us the tickets. Ask yourself, what if the 13 is the only number that doesn't have a price?